Hello, folks. This is Eddie Carson, and you're listening to WJOPLP Newburyport Joppa Radio 96.3, and this is Race Matters. And we're here to talk about Brother King, the Reverend Dr. Brother, the soulful Martin Luther King Jr., and this is January. And that means that we're going to see a lot of people, white folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, Asian folks, multiracial, biracial. We're going to see a whole lot of people, right wing, left wing, it doesn't matter, posting things all over their social media, talking about the greatness of King. And part of the problem in terms of some of those folks professing the greatness of King is they seem to do it from a positionality, sometimes of being uninformed, misinformed, often really not thinking about the radicalness of King, and really thinking about in many ways how we have come to sanitize, deodorize, add a little Clorox to the mix when we talk about this radical brother in terms of his radical proclivities. On Race Matters tonight, I got to tell you, I'm excited about our guest because I've been trying to get this brother on this show for a long time. And I'm just going to tell you, he's one of the best writers on the planet. Intellectually, he's brilliant. He has a soulful heart. And I'm just going to welcome my friend, my comrade to the microphone, Mr. And I'll ask that because I go by he, him pronouns, but I hate Mr. So I'm just going to go ahead and call you the Jack Garvey, and we'll go from that. Jack, brother, how you doing?
I now have a preferred definite article, the.
I'm going to throw the in because, boy, when that happens.
Jack or John, I go by. I'm comfortable with those.
What do you prefer, Jack or John?
Well, in Newburyport, I've used the name Jack because my family is round and about, and that was what I grew up with.
Absolutely.
That's how they know me.
So I like to think of us as friends. So, as a friend, what do I call you?
Well, you can call me anything you want.
Okay.
Jack.
Then that's what I'm going to do. I know you as Jack. My signature always says Edward, but my friends call me Eddie. And folks who don't know me too well, they like to call me Ed. And it is interesting about the Ed thing because even my high school buddy, best man in my wedding, he calls me Ed, and my mother cringes when she sees Ed. She's like, his name's not Ed. It's not even Eddie. It is Edward. Let's just keep it as white and European as possible, just to make sure folks are comfortable and everything too. So who knows? Hey, Jack, for the folks who are listening, what do you do? Let's talk about you for a little bit.
What do? I do as little as possible.
Okay, I want to join you in doing as little as possible.
I describe myself as semi-retired. That's why I have a lot of time to read and write over there on Plum Island. I get by with 1 day a week at the screening room.
On Wednesday, right?
Yes, Wednesdays. I've been a projectionist there since 1998. And I drive a delivery van for Winfrey's Fudge and Chocolate every Thursday.
You need to kind of, detour my way. I actually don't do that.
No, I won't do that.
I need a little less chocolate in my life, so who knows?
No, they send me out to Western Mass in case you want to chase me down and raid me. Like the the old days with the stagecoaches.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I always said, in my head, because I like mobster and gangster movies, I have that proclivity there. So I don't know. I know that's what they did to those soulful folks, Sacco and Vanzetti, back in the early part of the 20th century, and those two still got a raw deal.
Oh, they did.
Been rectified.
They did, yes.
Folks, if you don't know who Sacco and Vanzetti is, particularly if you live in Massachusetts, you need to just go online and you need to look them up because I can't get into their narrative or in the ways in which injustice was brought to anarchists who were charged with things that they never did.
I would be very surprised if many people could identify Sacco and Vanzetti. That's true of so many things. I mean, I'm from Lawrence, Massachusetts, which in 1912 was the site of one of the major strikes in labor movement history. It was the birth of Bread and Roses. And I was born there. I grew up there, went to elementary and high school there. I did not know a thing about that strike until I was a student at Salem State College. I was 25 miles away and happened to have a history professor and an English professor who liked to talk about actual things.
Absolutely.
They would be fired now if they were if they retired and are teaching in Florida. They'd be fired by now.
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the state of Florida may not even let me in just to take a vacation, but I'm not in a hurry to spend my money down there. And they would never employ me because I'm a truth teller, much like yourself. And I've read your many of your articles. And let's just say I would not be able to gain willful employment in the state of Florida, especially in terms of the profession, in terms of what I do as an academic, as a person who really constantly thinks about the injustices, particularly to black, brown, other people of color, queer folks, women, that takes place here in this capitalist country. Though that being the case, we're here to celebrate, congregate, and talk about Brother King. And I just got to go ahead and I got to ask you this question here. What was your first memory, your first experience, your first encounter in thinking about King growing up?
Oh, boy, I don't know if I can pin that down to a moment, but I can tell you that my father was very conscious about all of these things. So I have a hunch that it might have come through him. I remember him in conversations with other members of the family, that is aunts and uncles and friends. And, we're talking about the 1950s here when I was, before I was even 10 years old. And they would be coming down on King and Malcolm X, anything that had to do with civil rights as being outrageous and violent and all that. And my father kept putting the brakes on that and saying, that these people have just cause. There are reasons for this. So. Specifically, I remember something about this great march, which, August of 1963, I would have been 12 years old. So I was at least aware of that. And by the time I was a junior in high school, I knew more about it. I mean, there were a lot of us my age, and I'm talking about Catholic kids, mostly Irish, Italian ethnicity. We had this great basketball team that won a championship every single year with black players on it, and yet we're listening to people all around us, the older generation and all, condemn them. So I don't know if the word for this would be confusion, but I think we all knew that something was very wrong with the way things were. And as I say, sophomore year in high school, junior year in high school, we started becoming aware of, the names of who was doing what.
I mean, that's interesting, particularly, one of the questions I was going to ask you is, were you on that basketball team?
I'm talking about the Boston Celtics.
Are you talking about the Celtics?
Yes. I'm talking
okay.
about Bill Russell, Casey Jones,
yes.
Sam Jones, Satch Sanders.
Casey Jones, who later became the head coach for the Celtics.
That's right, yes.
And I actually met him when I was in the 6th grade. And it was interesting because when I met him, I was a Lakers fan. And, back in the 80s, if you were black, you rooted for the Lakers, right? And you saw that racial division, particularly where I come from, because the white folks.
Yes, I've heard this.
Yep, the white folks rooted for the Boston Celtics. Then, of course, over a period of time, we learned more and more and more, particularly from Bill Russell, a brother who recently passed away, about his disdain for the greater Boston area and his frustration. I think
Right.
he mended fences a little bit. But, I mean, here's someone who owned a home, and you probably know better than I do. So you can
Reading. It
correct
was
me.
in Reading.
In Reading, yes. And they ran him out.
Right.
They ran him out of town because
did.
of a black man owning a home, regardless of his legendary status as a basketball player.
That's
here.
right.
Crazy.
And I mean, he passed away, what, last year, sometime
Yep.
last year, in the honors and tributes. I mean, you think about this. This weekend, every January, we have this weekend with these honors and tributes of Martin Luther King. Back in the time that I was talking about, he may have been the most hated man in America.
Well, one of the stats I remember is we know his talk on the eve of his death in 1968, where he talked about, I went to the mountaintop.
Right.
And yet when he came back from the mountaintop, it's just a fabulous and interesting stat. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this stat. 55% of black folks disliked him.
Right.
72% of white folks did. And we know black folks, particularly, you had this burgeoning black bourgeoisie, middle-class folks who thought King was too radical in terms of being a champion for their plight during that time period.
Yes.
And you have the emergence by 68 of the Black Power movement that thought King and the Civil Rights movement was just a little too soft. So that's where that disdain comes from black folks. The 72% of white folks, which is interesting because on a previous show, I talked about a stat that was done in the early 21st century where about 81% of white folks either believe racism has ended or we're on the verge of eradicating racism here in the 21st century. And so what are your thoughts, particularly on the fact that on the eve of his death, as we celebrate him, 72% of white folks dislike King. And that's interesting when we think about what's taking place in the 21st century. Things around the fact that if King were alive today, they would probably say he's too woke. That he is buying in a critical race theory because he's telling the truth about racial injustices. So I think all of that folds into that 72%. What are your thoughts?
Yes, it does. It does. Well, I was living it at the time. That's what I just described. How is it that we could have athletes on these teams and also musicians whose music we danced to, that we loved, and at the same time be racist and have anything against Martin Luther King? One thing that people aren't aware of is that at that time there was this collusion of the press services, the United Press International, Associated Press, I think Reuters, and the agreement was that any photograph that they showed of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm, they had a list, and there were 3 names on it that I know of. That was King, Malcolm X, and Fidel Castro. Any photograph of one of those 3 people had to show them in some kind of pose that would be construed as scowling, jabbing the air, even if it was just in the middle of a sentence where their mouth happened to be a certain way, if it could be construed as angry and scowling, that was a picture that they would send around, and there would be no photographs of them with any kind of calm expression, and definitely nothing with them, with a smile or with a raised eyebrow or anything like that, which is especially strange considering that Martin Luther King, I don't know about Malcolm X or Castro, but Martin Luther King could have had a career as a stand-up comic.
Oh, okay. So I've read a lot. I'm quite versed on King, but this is new information. Tell me a little bit more about the stand-up part with King.
In his speeches, in his sermons, in the churches, he liked to illustrate his points by telling these stories. And one that I've heard several times in a recording because it was something that I've used, I have to admit, more than once in writing. He tells about the tale of Rip Van Winkle. Mm-hmm. And Rip Van Winkle, when he goes up the hill, he looks at the tree. There's a poster on the tree, and it's King George. And then he goes and he falls asleep for 20 years. And he comes down the hill, and there's a poster on the tree. And then he does a double take and looks over. And when King tells this story, he does all of this mugging and miming, and you can hear the audience in stitches. I haven't. I've never seen a video of this. There may be one, there may not be one. But on the audio, you can just tell by the inflection of his voice that he's working the crowd for laughs, and that he's mugging when he says, old Rip did a double take. Old Rip, and then the moral, old Rip slept through a revolution. Yeah, there are a lot of those.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, too, because there are a lot of folks who slept through, in many ways. I mean, it's hard to sleep through the radicalness of the 1960s, particularly when you're seeing the emergence of King. Mm-hmm. But when I say people slept during that time period, one of the things that, my mom and I disagree on, and then other folks do, is I consider the civil rights movement, in large part, to have been a failure. And I say that because I'm not convinced that the civil rights movement was radical enough. Oftentimes, I'm convinced the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, pushed forward through the works of LBJ and King, was really just some type of ideological Cold War messaging that the United States is not racist and white supremacy doesn't exist this way, which really hampered the kind of actual growth needed. Henceforth, one of the reasons why we're still struggling with racial inequities here in the 21st century.
I see your point, but my God, by that standard, everything's a failure.
Well, I'm not an optimistic person.
Okay.
I'm not an optimistic person.
Right. But your larger point, I mean, for sure, surface things have been taken to conceal anything in depth. That was the point of that address that you gave, the Garrison lecture, and It was the point of the column that I had in the Daily News yesterday. The immediate example that comes to mind is the phrase "content of character."
Not the color of skin.
Not the color of skin, the content of character. I mean, if you take that quote out of context, you can pretty much you can pretty much turn it right against King, and that has been done. Ronald Reagan did it in the 80s. It's taken out of context. You can read that as a condemnation of affirmative action.
Well, there's and again, I'm going to get his name wrong, but the whole fiasco among Republicans in terms of the House in trying to make a decision on who should be the next Speaker of the House. I heard someone say that it should be, I think, this black Republican. I'm always stunned that they're black Republicans, but this
from
black
Florida?
Yeah. Donaldson? Byron Donaldson or something. And someone made a comment, two crazy comments in that conversation. One, they point to the fact that Lincoln was a Republican, but we know Lincoln's not the same Republican as today. And they brought up the fact that we shouldn't think about the fact that Donaldson would be the first black Speaker of the House, but it makes sense because it's the Republican Party. The person who brought this forward stated that King was focused more on the content of one character, not the color of one's skin, when we've seen that Republicans have been some of the most race-baiting, anti-black party for a long time, but particularly here, but a long time, right? It's not even in the era of Trump, but we've really seen that magnified here in the 21st century.
Oh, yes. Yes. Trump, I guess, gets credit for making it more acceptable. Yes. People don't have to hide it anymore. Not that they completely hid it before, but Ronald Reagan's story about the welfare queen and the Cadillac.
Yes.
I mean, these things are just completely made up. But it's a stereotype that people are already suspicious of, and it's simple. That's the key, Edward. It's just simple, and that's what they go for.
Let's dumb it down. Let's make it a position where average folk who don't read, they can do maybe a couple sentences, maybe a Twitter account if they get to that, 140 characters, and they can get their information just based off that. And we've seen that. You know, you mentioned your article that was published yesterday. Tell us a little bit about it. I've read it. It was intriguing as you talked about the realities and honoring King through that piece.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm trying to think of what triggered it. There were many things that I was hearing, and I think, you know, there's a common complaints that people make about, the huge salaries that sports stars make, or the amount of money that it costs to go here or there, or to buy this or that. And cable bills. You're always about cable bills. And, so those all clearly had something in common. And the last couple of years or so, been hearing complaints about these self-checkout counters. They have them at CBS and over in Amesbury at the Stop and Shop. And I won't go in one of those stores. I used to do anything that had to do with medications was out of CVS. As soon as those machines came in, I'm out of there. Off to Walgreens. I don't mean to do a commercial here.
That's okay.
But still, you know, apart from my own inconvenience or preferences, I'd hear people complain about them and complain about all these things. And wait a minute, these are the same people who will complain about paying taxes or complain about programs, affirmative action, whatever it is, infrastructure, and the whole idea of taxes going up. Even when their own taxes are not going to go up, it's only people making $400,000 has been the proposal. But that's, that doesn't sit. So and with the Martin Luther King holiday coming up, I knew about how after the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the 60s, he turned most of his attention to economic issues. And that was there before. I mean, that March on Washington in 63, the full title of that, wasn't it economic? It wasn't the word jobs, economics in there. So it wasn't strictly about race or about black people. It was about economic justice. So I went for those quotes. I knew that they were there, and I fit that into one piece. Of course, I use CVS and Stop and Shop as a lead because those are the two local items that are in that column, and it is something that everybody has noticed.
Yes.
Whether they approve of it or not, or whether they use those self-checkouts or not, that was the way to grab attention.
No, and it was well written, as all of your pieces are. And I personally, I don't go to self-checkout lanes no matter where I am, and I refuse. Oftentimes, if nothing's available, I just say, well, I just need to go somewhere else because I'm not going to contribute to the further employment of other folks through mechanization that's happening. Mm-hmm. Been accused of being a Luddite. You're more of a Luddite than I am when it comes to cell phones and stuff. So
I don't have one.
I know. Trust me. I can reach you, and I know how to reach you. And I always tell folks that I'm not quick on the cell phone all the time. the joke towards me is, well, if you want to get a hold of Eddie, let's just send him smoke signals.
Okay.
and that'll come up. But so as we enter,
I have to interrupt you for a second.
Go ahead.
You know how to get a hold of me. Yeah, you should do. And when you get a hold of me, you say, "Hey, we need to get together." And so I'm thinking, well, he has in mind the grog for a couple of beers, something like that. And I wind up here. Now here I am, talking into microphones and looking at a camera.
Well, I mean, again, I know how to get a hold of you,
and I know how to get even with people who do these things to me.
Absolutely. So January pops up, and over the years, we've come to a position where we have softened King. We've made him more palatable to folks who don't remember or never understood nor knew, or those who thought they did. Their memory has become a bit part of amnesia for the fact that you mentioned things such as jobs and justice and the March on in Washington in August of 1963. But I'll never forget the idea that, I think that march was on August 28th, 1963, a day after W.E.B. Du Bois passed away on August 27th.
Oh, I didn't realize
1963, yep, at the age of 95. And, you had marches of folks who were in D.C. when word got out that Brother Du Bois had passed away down in Ghana. He kind of went into self-exile, really thinking about the fact that racial justice, economic justice will never take place in a place like the United States. He hung out with Nkrumah down in Ghana. And so when I think about that August 28th march, King would talk about the fact that, I think it was on September, I'm going to get this date wrong, but I'm close. I want to say it was around September 13th, maybe the 12th, where those 4 black girls, the young girls, were bombed at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, mainly because they were already starting to do what the court said back in 54. Let's desegregate. Let's make this happen. And King would go to their funeral, and one of the things that he stated at their funerals was the fact that these girls are dying not because of the not because of the content of the character, but they're being martyred because of the color of their skin. Mm-hmm. Really drawing that parallel that we have idealized that march. And white supremacy loves this, going back to your affirmative action point. Let's stop talking about race. King didn't want us to talk about race, but yet weeks after that march, he's attending his funeral where 4 black girls, all under the age of 13, 12, are going to die because of the color of their skin, reminding folks that nothing has been achieved. And I'm convinced that's where he was even at the point of his assassination in Memphis in 1968. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where we were.
Oh, there's a lot of evidence for that. That quote that I used in the column about America was heading into the dark ages. We are heading into another dark ages. That came near the end of his life as well. So, he knew what was coming.
Would you say we're still in those dark ages today?
Oh, gosh. Yes. What makes it painful is that the light is there. If all people have to do is look, it really amuses me to hear, and this was mentioned in the column, to hear people complain about the removal of statues in public squares, especially the Confederate statues and memorials and all. And the first line you hear them say, "How will we know our history?" I mean, no, that's not that's a whitewash, but. Of course, I feel like, say, do you ever read a book?
Yeah, I wonder about that.
There is that. Would I say that we're in the dark? Yes, we are. I wonder if the problem is not so much the the divisions that we keep thinking. We talk conservative, liberal, black, white, straight, gay, red, blue, and all that. I'm wondering if it's simple and complex. I mean, Donald Trump came along and he offered something very simple: make America great again.
Well, you're talking about great in the 1950s and the 1960s, where
And
I couldn't even go into I couldn't attend a white school. We had Governor George Wallace on the steps at the University of Alabama.
That's right. He was your governor.
He was, yeah. Not my governor, although some black folks did vote for him, believing that maybe, there could be some form of justice through this means and measure that was there. But, I mean, he's going to be the one who's going to profess what? And I'm going to misquote him a little bit. Segregation today, segregation now, segregation forever.
Yes, that was his cry. And there was also Lurleen Wallace.
Yes.
Okay.
Who would take over for him, right, when he was sick, and of course after he got gunned down,
right,
and it was incapacitated, in a wheelchair after that too, really to try to carry on that populist platform, in populism, right? We've seen that today, which has really become buzzword for, horrible acts of white supremacy.
I can't say for certain what I would be like or what I'd be thinking had I grown up in Alabama or Mississippi or even Kentucky or Maryland, for God's sake. But here in the North, we were insulated from most of that, maybe a blip on the radar. But do you here and there, and so to us, those were very simple times. Father knows best.
But would you say though that the North was really kind of insulated from those things, or taking on a passive perspective that's something that happens in Mississippi and Alabama, but yet it doesn't happen here because we have a lot of great white liberals who we fought for abolitionists, and we welcome people of color, which we've already talked about, Bill Russell and that challenge, when those things existed then as they do today.
Okay. Of course, I would have been older by the time I was hearing them and listening to them and could identify them. Yes.
So we're in agreement.
Yes, we are in agreement.
Yeah. No, I mean that's good. I mean, again, and you know me, I've been critical of New England, critical of Massachusetts, critical of white liberals at times where they hide behind this notion that I'm not racist, but yet I'm not doing anything to change the economic conditioning or the experience that black and brown folks are experiencing that King advocated for. But what I can do is I can read a quote, I can post a great quote by King on social media and feel good and pat myself on the back and be in good shape because, I've done my deed for the day.
Sure.
365 days in a year, and I'm going to think about inequities and injustice one day by merely posting something on social media.
Yes. Well, to fit in with what the point I was starting to make before, these quotes, take them out of context, post them, and they are very simple. Taken out of context, they are very simple. Oh, I have a dream today. Oh, a dream. I mean, we see dreams on how many television commercials. People are dreaming all the time. And somehow it's always connected to material wealth or well-being.
I have to share an article I wrote years ago about how even his drummer boy, the speech was appropriated even by the King Foundation for commercialization, used in a car commercial.
Yes, I recall that. Yes.
Which was just, problematic because, again, I've had my own issues with the King family in recent years, particularly in the sense that I'm not convinced fully they're doing all the things they need to do to bring about the same justice that Brother King advocated for. And that's that quandary that we're in right now. And again, I will point out I'm not perfect either. I'm flawed like Brother King was.
Were you at the ceremony on Friday?
Down in Boston,
Yes.
the Embrace. I wasn't there mainly because on my campus we were celebrating King. We had a full day of programming and everything, which was quite successful thanks to a number of my colleagues and guests who were there. I will say, since you brought up the Embrace, I actually like it.
Yes.
I've read all the criticism of the Embrace, but I think
People are finding fault with it.
a lot of people stated that at one point, if you look at it from one angle, it looks like someone holding a penis. Someone saying they can't really figure out what it looks like or makes sense. But it was one of King's sons, Martin Luther King III.
Right.
He said something that was great. He said, "Everywhere you go, everywhere you turn, you find lots of plaques, monuments, statues dedicated to my father, Martin Luther King Jr. But yet, a lot of folks don't know that Coretta Scott King played a huge role in moving King to the left and thinking about justice." I mean, King drove a nice fancy car. He was a middle class person.
Yeah.
And he met Coretta Scott, and she said, you need to rethink these things. You need to really rethink your conditioning. And so it's back to your point about the Embrace. That's about the relationship between Martin and Coretta.
Oh, sure.
And how she was there the whole time, though she becomes invisible. That's why I like the statue. I think it speaks. There's no context needed.
No.
For that.
No, there isn't. It struck me that it all happened Friday, and what you just described with your at the school, you're talking about Friday. Everything happening on Friday, which was the day before the weekend and the holiday,
Yes.
and the holiday on which everything is closed, and so everybody stops work to celebrate the life of a man who never stopped working.
Right.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, I mean, it should be a day, instead of taking the day off, we should be taking the day on.
I love that.
I mean, maybe not go ahead with, regular programming, classes as they are scheduled that day, but seminars, events, and things to do with awareness of the day. Awareness, by the way, which is the full word of the abbreviated woke.
Absolutely.
Which is, and it is amazing to me that people seem unaware, completely, here's the word again, unaware that woke is an abbreviation for aware.
Well, and no one's going to do that. Woke has become kind of this new phraseology by youngsters, hipsters, right-wing folks would say the radical left in that sense. And even on my campus, spending a day on a Friday before the actual holiday is a way to carry it into the weekend, to be reflective.
Sure.
And going into that Monday, honoring and thinking about, this isn't a day that, and I like your point, we just take off. But we embrace. I'm very conscientious when I tell folk, happy MLK Day. Much like people would say, happy 4th of July. That's not actually a part of the vernacular for most people. In many ways, most people don't even know the holidays coming up like they do the 4th of July. Oh, Frederick Douglass, of course, and we could talk about him for a long time. We'll have to do that another time. Would say, absolutely, the unawareness about what this means for so many folks, and a reminder that, to my mother's point, we have made progress, right? We're here in this interracial capacity having this conversation. We have a relationship, as I do. I'm a black man who is a senior leader and administrator at a predominantly white institution that caters to less than 1% of the population. I'm fully aware of that. I know, hard to, when you think about that, but yet, let's just stop and ponder not only the celebration of how far we've come, but let's just think critically about here, and what year is it? 2023?
Yeah.
The many steps backwards we continue to take every time we think there's some kind of social progress. And who are those folks who are resisting social, economic, and political progress. You can't, and as I always tell folks, don't tell me you love me. You can't tell me you love me. You can't tell me you care about me when you walk into that voting booth and you vote against my interests and all the interests that Brother King was trying to make. You don't love me as soon as you cast that ballot. I'm not optimistic, my friend.
Did you hear what happened in the Missouri state legislature a few days ago?
I did not. Tell us.
This is a Republican-controlled legislature in Missouri.
Of course it is. It's Missouri.
Missouri. They voted a dress code for women.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not. I'm not making this up. I am not making this up. They now have a dress code for women who are in the legislature.
And the fact that there are men who would allow that to happen, women who would applaud that, although this is still a male supremacy problem. I'm not going to put this on women. But I mean, it's even like in Arkansas. I lived in Arkansas. I went to undergrad and graduate school in the state of Arkansas. You know, I lived there, worked there for a number of years, and they recently elected Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
I know.
And the daughter of Mike Huckabee.
I know.
There's a lot of problems with this. You know, one of the first executive orders she made on Friday, the same day that my students are congregating and celebrating King, her first executive order, of all the many, many problems that exist in Arkansas, she has banned the use of Latinx.
Oh, yes, I did hear that.
From any government document in terms of identity.
Yes.
And that's anti-queerness. That's anti-LGBTQ. That's anti a lot of things. Gee, way to celebrate Brother King through one of your first executive orders.
You know, it doesn't, in a way, it has no, things like that have no substance to them at all, and yet they work as red meat for the what is now the Republican base. All of this nonsense. I mean, it happened years in North Carolina. The state legislature put a ban on the use of the word erosion.
Yes.
When talking about development along the coast.
I remember that.
And Florida had a couple, even before DeSantis. Wasn't there a gag order on? It might have also been erosion.
Well, we know under DeSantis in Florida, the "Don't Say Gay" bill.
Yeah, right.
That's in place too. So, I mean, all of these things, right? We're bringing this to the consciousness to those of you who are listening to Race Matters here at WJOP-LP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. But, you know, I hope as you engage in this conversation between Jack and myself, you're really thinking conscientiously about yourself, about, you know, your own behavior as I reflect and ponder my own behavior, not just this time every year, because the reality, and I even had a student say this brilliantly, and that is this. He stated, he said, Eddie, I don't have to think about being white. I don't have to think about all those things because that's part of the privileges that I have. I navigate through this sea of spaces unaware. And I turned to that student and I said, no, I don't think you're unaware for the fact that you made that point, but I think about it 24/7. So when we talk about one day out of the year, when we ask folks to just engage in this celebration about where we are, where we've been, and what's going to happen moving forward, this is what I do every single day when I enter spaces where I'm always the only one who looks like me. Always. Even at that lecture you attended a year ago. All right, I'm the only one who looks like me. And I'm not afraid to really point that out to folks who exist in a sea of privilege.
Sure.
That's there. So, Jack, let me ask you this. Tell me, a year ago we had a conversation and I was really appreciative of the great article you wrote about my talk, and even the criticism you had about my omission, thinking about particularly Caleb Cushing, and that's another episode, but we're going to come back to that one day in the future. I talked about King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I don't think a lot of people have read, and if they have, they don't understand it. But in that conversation, you talked about how you've taught that document in the past.
Yes.
You've engaged students and other folks in it and thinking about King. Say a little bit about that.
I taught freshman writing classes. I was on the adjunct circuit. So there were a lot of semesters that I had at UMass Lowell, but I was also at Mass Bay Community College and a few others. I always made sure that the text that I had for that class was in an anthology. It would always be in an anthology, but I always made sure that that anthology included King's letter from Birmingham jail. And the reason for it was because more than one reason. One is it is so relevant, and we're talking about. I'm talking about students who are mostly 17 and 18 years old, so they're just sort of coming into this and getting to know it, and they're coming out of their high schools for the first time. They're in college. They're seeing other kinds of people for the first time. And so there was that, but also as an example of writing and of how to write, those contrapuntal phrases, the imagery, the analogies in there. The church should be working as the headlights to show us the way to go, but it acts more like the taillights that show us where we've been. It just... so many of them. So it was a treat to go through that also. And I didn't notice it when I first started teaching it, but there is a music to that language. There was a rhythm that never lets up. It's like Shakespeare's iambic pentameter. It's all very natural, and it sustains itself. So yes, that was a must to have that.
Well, I mean, you think about, I'm someone who I listen to a lot of lectures. I've listened to a number of folks from Ta-Nehisi Coates to Brother King. I give lots of lectures and I listen to their patterns, and I sit there and I imagine King in that Birmingham jail, really talking about the injustices that are taking place in Birmingham. And as we know, his condemnation of northern white liberals,
yes,
right, for their, I don't even know the word to use, their passive engagement in the struggles, because we know he talks in much of his works about the northern ghettos and places where black folks live up north. The challenges in places like Boston and Manhattan and Chicago and Philadelphia, for example. These places are not immune to the problems of economic and racial justice.
That's right.
That's there. So
100 years earlier, Henry David Thoreau made the same point.
Oh, say a little bit more. And I'm a big fan of Thoreau.
The essay "Slavery in Massachusetts: Working Conditions."
I have read that
for people in the mills and living conditions for them. Herman Melville wrote about it. It was well known. It was a sore point, but somehow the North was able to keep it under wraps.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up Melville. I've yet to read Moby Dick. That's on my list. I'm about to engage in that here pretty soon. But I do know it's interesting. I'm one of those people who listen to lectures and read about things I want to read to really grasp a better understanding. But Melville's talking about, this multiracial ship, because we know,
yes,
right, and what that was like being out on sea among people. And you pointed this out about students coming from their homogenous communities,
yes,
into their colleges where it's multiracial, it's interracial, and having to engage in different ways. And Melville really speaks to that quite well.
Sure. Yes. He before he wrote Moby Dick, he wrote these they're not exactly novels. They're sort of halfway between travelogues and novels in the South Pacific islands, where he went AWOL from the ship and lived with the natives for a time. But there are commentaries in his first two books, Taipei and Omu, where he talks about the missionaries that went into Tahiti and into the Sandwich Islands, now the Hawaiian Islands, and the damage that they did. I mean, the criticism of Protestant and Catholic missionaries out there in the South Seas, it is damning. It is as harsh as it can be. It makes me wonder how he got away with it.
Well, and again, it's true to say, I'm sure some Melville scholars and others are critiquing in ways that, they've included him in that canon. And I love the point you made earlier about including a letter from a Birmingham jail in an anthology of collections, really to break this, quote unquote, canon, because we know who creates the canon and call things a canon. And oftentimes the canon is exclusionary of other folks. Even we talk about Brother King. As we get to the end here of Race Matters, and brother, we've been on just about an hour.
Really?
Yeah, it goes by fast.
I wish my exercise would go by that fast.
I can think of a lot of things that I love to go as fast as this show, especially when I have brilliant and great folks such as you, Jack, on this show. So, as I always like to do as I bring the show to a close, I always like my guests. I'm going to ask Jack Garvey, who's here with me, to just give a final thought or a final word thinking about Brother King as we bring this to an end.
One thing that we've left out is that the first person who really grabbed my attention was James Baldwin.
Oh, I love that.
And he wrote the essays that became The Fire Next Time.
Oh, that is wonderful.
He wrote them, I think, in the late 50s and into the 60s, and then the book that came out in the spring of 1963. The March on Washington was August of 1963. I have to believe that Martin Luther King read that book, and he started thinking how he could interpret that thought, that push, into something that people would willingly join, accept and join. Baldwin's prose is fiery. It is fierce, ferocious. And, usually, because I read it 4 or 5 years later. I'm a junior in high school. And you think of a person reading a book, you think of them sitting there, the book's like this, and it's in their hands. No, this one, the arms came out of the book, and the hands were here shaking, wake up, white boy, like that. And I remember, that happened at the time. But in retrospect, I believe that Martin Luther King took The Fire Next Time and turned it into The Fierce Urgency of Now. Well, that's a line from that speech. That's a phrase that Obama quoted numerous times, and it was taking Baldwin's militant and insistent stand and making it something more of a challenge to the American public, both black and white, and anyone else. Be there. 5 years later, the Chambers Brothers came along, and their song, their iconic song, was "Time Has Come Today." Think about The Fire Next Time. Fire is fierce. Next is urgent. Time is now. and then the Chambers brothers take the same phrase and give it another interpretation. Time has come today.
Folks, you're listening to Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson. This is WJOP-LP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. I think you have just heard why I believe Jack Garvey is one of the most brilliant people I've encountered. He's being humble, and I'm glad he thinks it's nonsense, because I haven't been around him. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll continue to tune in as we bring a prophetic message to you here. Be well. Happy MLK Day. Go check out The Embrace. Continue to think about Brother King 365 days out of the year, not just one day in January. And get ready, because we still have Black History Month coming up. And no, for folks who used to tell me, why don't we have White History Month? That's another show altogether. I'm Eddie Carson. I'm here with Jack Garvey. We're out of here. Thank you so much.